I was 25 years old, a young man named Michael living in Ohio in 2014, and every morning felt the same. I woke up in my small apartment, staring through the window at streets that carried more silence than life. The factories that once gave this city its heartbeat had shut down, leaving behind skeletons of rust and broken glass. Whole neighborhoods looked abandoned, houses with boarded doors and peeling paint, reminders of better days that never returned. As a man, I should have felt energy, ambition, hunger to build something, but instead, I carried the same stillness that surrounded me. My routine was predictable. I made cheap coffee, turned on the television, and waited for the warehouse shift to begin. At work, I was just another body, lifting boxes and scanning labels, one more man drifting through hours without purpose. I wasn't weak in body, but my spirit was heavy, drained by repetition. Around me, co-workers grumbled about bad luck, unfair bosses, and politicians who didn't care. I listened, I nodded, and slowly, I became one of them. Their excuses became my excuses, their bitterness became mine. When night arrived, I drowned in other people's lives. Television shows painted pictures of wealth and fame. Social media feeds screamed of joy, travel, success. I scrolled endlessly, a grown man wasting his hours staring at strangers he would never meet. My phone often slipped from my hand as I fell asleep, my eyes burning, my mind empty. Each night I told myself I would change tomorrow, but each tomorrow looked exactly like yesterday. Friends around me lived in the same cycle. Weekends meant bars and loud laughter, jokes covering the truth that Monday would always return. My neighbors stood on porches, gossiping about others, never daring to speak about their own pain. Dreams became a distant memory, something only children were allowed to have before life broke them. I was a man with a strong body but no fire, walking through days as though my future had already been decided by the walls of this city. On late evenings, I walked home under flickering streetlights, the pavement cracked, the air empty. The city looked as if it had stopped trying, and I feared I was doing the same. Time weighed on me like a shadow. Even though I was only 25, I felt decades older. Inside, I knew hours were slipping through my fingers, but I buried that truth beneath distractions. I promised myself that one day I would leave, one day I would build, one day I would live. Yet that day never came. The city without a voice mirrored the silence inside me. Abandoned buildings reflected my unspoken goals. Empty streets carried the echo of chances I had already wasted. I was a young man, but I felt invisible, fading into the background of a life I never wanted. Every morning looked the same, every night ended the same, and each day whispered the same cruel thought. Maybe this is all I will ever be.
One night I came home from the warehouse later than usual, my boots heavy with dust and my back sore from the day. I threw my jacket on the chair and sat in silence, the television screen glowing but muted. For some reason, I opened an old box in the corner of my apartment, a box I hadn't touched in years. Inside were scattered papers, receipts, and photographs. Among them, I found a picture of my father. He looked young, strong, full of life, his eyes fixed on something beyond the frame, as if the future belonged to him. But I knew how his story ended. He died too early, and with him died the plans he never had the chance to fulfill. Staring at that photograph, I felt a sharp realization that I had been lying to myself. I kept telling myself I had time, that one day I would start, that one day I would live differently. But my father's silence in that photo reminded me that someday never arrives for those who keep waiting. The sound of the clock on my wall seemed louder that night. Each second was a reminder that time was not mine to waste. I was not killing time by sitting still. Time was killing me. Every hour I spent scrolling, every morning I hit snooze, every excuse I repeated, all of it was another piece of life I would never recover. I thought about the past week and realized I could not remember one meaningful thing I had done. Days blended together like pages of a blank notebook, and I had allowed them to pass without writing anything worth keeping. That night I could not sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my heart restless. I pictured myself 10 years older, still in the warehouse, still making excuses, still promising tomorrow. The image scared me more than failure ever could. It showed me the truth. If I did nothing, I would not just lose my dreams, I would lose myself. The idea of waking up at 35 or 40 with nothing but regrets and wasted years was a weight pressing on my chest. I realized I had been waiting for someone to save me, for the world to change, for opportunities to knock at my door. But the world owed me nothing. No one was coming to carry me out of this routine. Everyone else was too busy fighting their own battles. I had only one person who could change the direction of my life, and that was me. It was not an inspiring thought at first. It was terrifying. Responsibility felt heavy, but it was the only truth left. So I opened a notebook I had bought months earlier and never used. On the first page, I wrote a sentence that burned in my mind. I am responsible for my life. My handwriting looked shaky, but the words were clear. I listed the problems I could see: wasted time, lack of discipline, endless distractions, fear of failure. Next to each one, I forced myself to write a solution, even if it was small. Wake up earlier. Limit social media. Learn something new every day. Speak up even if I made mistakes. It wasn't much, but it was the first real plan I had made in years. I closed the notebook and sat in silence. The clock was still ticking, and for the first time, I understood its message. My life was not endless. My chances were not infinite. Each day was a currency I had been spending carelessly, and the account was shrinking. I thought of my father again, his unfinished story, and I told myself I would not let mine end the same way. I could not control the past, and I could not control how much time I had left, but I could control what I did with the hours still in my hands. From that night on, the sound of ticking no longer blended into the background. It was a constant reminder, a voice telling me to move, to build, to stop pretending that tomorrow was guaranteed. I understood that life had already begun, and I was late to my own story. I could no longer afford to exist quietly. The clock demanded more of me, and I had to answer.
The deeper I went into breaking my routines, the more I realized how much of my life had been built around avoiding discomfort. Every decision I had made in the past was designed to protect me from pain, rejection, or failure. I stayed in the warehouse because it was safe. I stayed in my small apartment because it was easy. I stayed in habits that numbed me because they never challenged me. Comfort had been a silent poison, convincing me that survival was enough. But survival without growth was nothing more than a slow death. I started to design small tests for myself. I woke up an hour earlier and went for runs in the cold Ohio mornings, even when my lungs burned and my legs felt heavy. I forced myself to cook proper meals instead of reaching for processed food. I looked in the mirror and spoke to myself in English, stumbling and making mistakes, my voice shaky and awkward. It felt ridiculous at first, but I kept going. Every uncomfortable action was proof that I was not the same man I had been. At work, the rebellion became harder. Everyone else seemed content to drift, and my refusal to complain or waste time made me stand out. I heard whispers, jokes about me trying to be better than the rest. Some coworkers told me to relax, that nothing would change anyway. For a moment, I almost believed them. But then I remembered that their comfort was the very trap I was escaping. I was not better than them, but I refused to keep choosing the same prison. In the evenings, I dedicated time to learning. I used old books, free online lessons, and recordings to push my mind beyond the warehouse walls. My brain resisted. I grew tired quickly, lost focus, felt restless. But I pushed through because I knew growth always demanded pain. I understood that if I waited for motivation, I would wait forever. So I chose discipline instead. Even when I did not feel like it, I sat down and worked on myself. That simple act became my quiet declaration of war. The discomfort was not only physical or mental, it was emotional. I had to distance myself from old friends who only wanted to spend nights drinking and mornings recovering. I had to cut back on hours spent online, scrolling through the lives of people who didn't know I existed. I had to endure the loneliness that came with silence. At first, it was unbearable. I felt cut off, as if I had abandoned the only world I knew. But then I realized the silence was not my enemy. It was space for me to build something new. The more I pushed against comfort, the more alive I felt. My body grew stronger, my mind sharper, and my will harder. Each small act of defiance stacked upon the last, forming a new identity. I was no longer the man who hid from discomfort. I was the man who sought it, knowing it was the only path to freedom. My rebellion was not dramatic, not visible to the world, but it was real. Every time I chose the harder path, I wrote a new sentence in the story I had once been too afraid to begin. Every morning became a confrontation between two versions of myself. One wanted to rise early, train, learn, and move forward, while the other begged for comfort, demanded more sleep, and whispered that none of this mattered. The war was invisible to the outside world, but inside me, it was constant. I understood now that no enemy could ever harm me more than the weaker version of myself.
He lived in my thoughts, in my habits, in my excuses, and every day I had to face him. The battle began with small choices. When the alarm rang, one voice told me to get up, while the other tempted me with another hour of rest. When I sat at my desk with a book, one voice pushed me to continue, the other urged me to open my phone and lose myself in distractions. At first, the weaker voice often won. I would tell myself I deserved a break, that skipping one day did not matter, that I would make up for it tomorrow. But each time I gave in, I felt the weight of failure pressing down on me, reminding me that I was still chained to the old version of myself. I started writing down my victories and defeats. If I chose discipline, I marked it with a check. If I surrendered to laziness, I wrote it down as a loss. Seeing it on paper made the battle real. It showed me patterns. The lazy version of me was strongest at night, when fatigue blurred my focus, and in the morning, when comfort seemed sweeter than progress. So I built small strategies. I left my phone in another room before bed. I placed my shoes by the door so that I had no excuse not to move when I woke up. The fight was not about huge achievements. It was about controlling the battlefield of my habits. Some days I lost badly. I stayed in bed too long, wasted hours online, ate without thought, and told myself lies that I would do better tomorrow. On those days, shame followed me everywhere. I felt like I was watching myself from outside, seeing a man betray his own goals. But I refused to let those losses define me. I reminded myself that battles are lost in every war, and what mattered was whether I continued to fight. Gradually, the stronger version of me began to win more often. The check marks in my notebook outnumbered the crosses. I felt pride when I looked at the list, not because I was perfect, but because I was finally consistent. Each small victory gave me momentum. Every time I resisted the weaker voice, I built evidence that I was capable of change. That evidence became my weapon. The struggle was exhausting, but it was also transforming me. I no longer avoided the fight. I welcomed it. I understood that growth meant daily confrontation, that every choice shaped the man I was becoming. It was never about defeating the world outside. It was always about defeating the part of me that wanted to stay the same. The war was endless, but so was my determination. I was no longer afraid of the battle. I was becoming forged by it. Taking risks had always terrified me, but I reached a point where standing still became more dangerous than moving forward. I decided that if I wanted to live differently, I had to step into uncertainty, no matter how unprepared I felt. The idea of creating something of my own haunted me every day, and eventually I chose to act. I had no savings to speak of, but I took the little money I had and bought used tools from a garage sale. I cleared out a corner of my apartment, then later borrowed a friend's shed and turned those cramped spaces into my first workshop. It was nothing more than a table, a set of second-hand saws, and piles of discarded wood, but it felt like the beginning of something real. The first pieces I built were clumsy. I made a small coffee table with uneven legs and a chair that wobbled every time I sat on it. I documented each attempt, not to share with others, but to remind myself that imperfection was part of the process. Every mistake carried a lesson. When I cut wood too short, I learned patience. When I used the wrong nails and the piece collapsed, I learned precision. Each failure burned my pride, but it also sharpened my skill. I began offering to repair furniture for neighbors. Most of them doubted me, but a few agreed to let me try. I charged almost nothing, sometimes just enough to cover materials. Some projects ended with disappointed looks, others with cautious smiles. Each interaction was a risk. Each knock on a stranger's door with my rough creations in hand forced me to face the possibility of rejection. But every time I took that step, I felt alive. My evenings transformed into long hours in the workshop. I watched tutorials online, scribbled notes, and experimented with designs. I stayed awake past midnight, sanding boards, staining surfaces, inhaling the scent of wood and glue. The process was exhausting, but exhaustion now had meaning. I wasn't wasting time in front of a screen, I was shaping something tangible with my own hands. The risks were not only technical, but financial. I maxed out a credit card to buy better tools, knowing I could not afford to fail. I set up a simple website by myself, even though I knew nothing about design, and posted photographs of my uneven tables and chairs. They looked unprofessional, but at least they were mine. The first order came from a stranger who wanted a handmade bookshelf. I nearly turned it down, afraid I would disappoint him, but I forced myself to accept. I worked for days, measuring twice, cutting slowly, reassembling until my hands ached. When I finally delivered the bookshelf, the customer nodded with approval. It was not perfect, but it was sturdy, and he paid me in cash. That small envelope felt heavier than any paycheck I had received from the warehouse. It wasn't the amount, it was the proof that risk could bring reward. Not all attempts succeeded. Some months I lost money, repairing pieces that broke or refunding clients who were unhappy. I doubted myself constantly, questioned whether I was wasting time. Yet even in those moments of loss, I felt stronger than I had before. Risk taught me resilience. Failure taught me humility. Each setback became a reminder that I was not hiding anymore. I was playing the game, and the game itself was shaping me. I stopped waiting for approval from others. My coworkers still laughed, my relatives shook their heads, and friends suggested I should not waste my energy. But I no longer sought their permission. I had chosen my own path, and I was willing to pay the price for it. The fear that had once paralyzed me was still present, but it no longer ruled me. Fear became fuel, proof that I was standing at the edge of growth. Through these risks, I felt reborn. I was no longer the man who drifted through days in silence. I was the man who risked money he didn't have, who risked embarrassment, who risked failure, and who accepted that nothing meaningful could exist without stepping into uncertainty. Each risk, no matter how small, was a declaration that my life was mine to shape. For the first time, I felt the fire that had been missing for years. I was alive not because life had become easier, but because I finally dared to make it harder. I stood in front of the small workshop I had built, looking at the uneven wooden sign I had carved by hand. The year was 2017, and 3 years had passed since I first picked up those used tools. The workshop was not grand, just a converted shed with a cracked concrete floor and shelves stacked with wood. But it was mine. The hum of my sander, the smell of varnish, the piles of sawdust that clung to my boots, these had become the rhythm of my life. Each sound, each scent reminded me that I had chosen this path instead of letting time choose it for me. Time was no longer something abstract to me. It was a force I felt in my bones. I had learned that the clock never slowed for fatigue, never paused for hesitation, never granted second chances. Every morning it demanded an answer. Would I waste another day or build something worth remembering? I started keeping a calendar on the wall, not to mark holidays or birthdays, but to track actions. Every square contained either a step forward or a mark of regret. This visual map of my choices kept me honest. I created routines that gave structure to the hours. I woke at 5 each morning, brewed strong coffee, and spent the first 30 minutes reading. Sometimes it was a book on business, sometimes a manual on woodworking, sometimes a story of someone who had turned struggle into strength. Those 30 minutes set the tone for the day, reminding me that growth began with focus. After that, I would step into the workshop and commit to at least one tangible task before breakfast: cutting, sanding, sketching designs. No matter how small, I wanted proof that I had invested in my future before the sun rose. The warehouse was still part of my life for a time, but I treated it differently. I no longer saw it as a permanent sentence. It became fuel, a place that gave me just enough to support my risks. I carried a small notebook in my pocket during shifts, scribbling ideas for designs between lifting boxes. Some coworkers mocked me, but their laughter faded into the background. I was no longer fighting for their approval. I was fighting against time itself. Each project I completed carried a weight beyond wood and nails. A dining table built from reclaimed oak was not just furniture. It was a symbol that I had taken hours others would have wasted and turned them into something permanent. A repaired rocking chair for an elderly neighbor was not just service. It was proof that my hands could bring value into the world. I began to see every finished piece as a chapter in a larger story, and that story gave meaning to every sacrifice I had made. The most powerful realization came when I looked at myself in the mirror one night. My hands were rougher, my face older, but my eyes were alive in a way they had never been before. I was not waiting anymore. I was acting. And in those eyes, I saw the truth. The greatest tragedy would not be failure, but regret. Failure could teach me. Regret could only haunt me. I thought often of the years I had lost to distractions, the countless hours scrolling through meaningless content, the nights wasted in bars, the mornings surrendered to laziness. I could not reclaim them, but I could make sure I never repeated that mistake. Time had already taken enough from me. I would not give it more willingly. I promised myself to treat every hour like currency, to invest it where it mattered. This new relationship with time changed everything. I no longer said later. If I had an idea, I acted on it. If I needed to learn a skill, I started immediately. If fear appeared, I treated it as a signal that I was moving in the right direction. I stopped postponing phone calls, projects, and opportunities. I understood that hesitation was another way of wasting life, and I refused to hand over my future to hesitation. By the end of that year, I had enough clients to step away from the warehouse. It was not easy, and the income was uncertain, but I accepted the uncertainty as part of the price of freedom. Every day I worked for myself, time felt sharper, more alive. There was no safety net, but there was no longer the slow suffocation of waiting. Each risk, each challenge, each late night in the workshop reminded me that I was not wasting my limited years. Looking back, I realized the most important step had never been picking up tools, starting a business, or even finishing a project. The most important step had been understanding that time was finite. That knowledge had become my compass, guiding me every day. It forced me to stop living like I had forever and start living like each day was my only chance. As I locked the door of my workshop one cold evening, I listened to the quiet around me. The same streets that once felt dead now felt alive, not because they had changed, but because I had. I had turned wasted hours, fear into fuel, and time into my sharpest teacher. I knew the clock would never stop ticking, but I no longer feared its sound. It reminded me that life was short, and that was exactly why it was worth fighting for every single day.
Thanks! Please subscribe and like. Spin a new yarn with us every week. See you there!